Flashback starts strong and gets stronger.
Happy Thanksgiving! Not for me.
Immediately doing something new with the flashback, showing us things about our character that in the present day we could only be told. Here, that's Fat Monica and pre-nose job Rachel. This is not Fat Monica's first appearance, but it is always a crowd pleaser despite not aging so well. And pre-nose job Rachel is a new one, something we were aware of but hadn't actually seen before. There's also, behind it all, this sort of metatextual joke that the show, for fun, is uglying up these two actresses who are obviously astoundingly beautiful in real life.
Believe me.
We also get to see some dynamics play out in real time that similarly we could only have been told. Namely, the early days of Ross's lifelong lust for Rachel, which leads to a lot of great comedy beats.
Does it feel weird around here now? You know, since I've been away at college?
Oh,